If you think winter only truly begins when snow piles high and storms howl outside the door, then for medieval families, you have already arrived too late. For them, winter did not knock loudly. It came quietly, through signs so small that someone from our time would never notice. And it was precisely that quietness that was the most terrifying thing of all. There were no weather forecasts, no temperature numbers, no one warning that this winter would be harsher than the last. There was only a house where the fire still burned, yet the air no longer grew warm. There was only a meal still set on the table, yet the body no longer felt heat rising from within. There was only a child sleeping very soundly, too soundly. So still and silent that the adults began to feel afraid. Medieval families did not fear the cold the way we do. They feared the moment they realized their system of survival had begun to fall out of rhythm. When fire could no longer overcome dampness. When the smell of the hearth smoke changed. When livestock stood motionless in the corner of the byre, not eating, not making a sound. That was when they understood that this winter was not merely uncomfortable. It was preparing to take lives. Those signs were never written down in books, but they were passed from one generation to the next like a law of survival. Because ignoring them did not mean enduring a few more cold days. It meant the entire family would not live long enough to wait for spring. And the real question is not how cold the winter was. It is this: if you had lived in that time, would you have been alert enough to recognize the warning signs before everything became beyond saving? To understand why those small signs carried such life and death weight, we must abandon the modern way of viewing winter. For medieval people, winter was not a period marked on a calendar. It was a slow process of infiltration, like water seeping into wood, silent, but rotting it from the inside. By the time the cold fully revealed itself, most of the battle had already been lost. Medieval families did not wait for snow to fall before worrying. They watched their house first. A house was not merely a shelter, but a machine for survival. If that machine began to function poorly, winter would turn it into a trap. Earthen walls, packed floors, thatched roofs all had thermal memory. When moisture accumulated for too long, those materials no longer held heat, but began to draw it out of the bodies living inside. At that point, burning more firewood was no longer a solution, but simply a waste of precious resources. Medieval families understood this very clearly. They did not ask, "How cold is it outside?" but rather, "Does the house still respond to fire?" A healthy house would slowly warm up after the hearth was lit. A weakened house would remain just as cold, no matter how fiercely the flames burned. This difference did not lie in feeling, but in experience paid for through many winters before. But the house was only one part of the system. The other part was the human body itself. Medieval people had no concept of calories or metabolism, but they understood intuitively that food had to produce heat. When a hot meal no longer helped the body recover, when the cold still clung to bones and joints despite eating well, that was a dangerous sign. It showed that the energy taken in was no longer sufficient to sustain life under harsh conditions. The danger lay in the fact that this phase did not trigger panic immediately. Everything still looked fine. The fire still burned. The pot still boiled. People still woke up every morning. But it was precisely this false normalcy that made many families careless. They continued to consume firewood, continued to divide rations the same way, continued to believe that enduring just a little longer would be enough. Meanwhile, the system of survival was quietly sliding downhill. The families who survived were the ones who did not wait until the cold became unbearable. They paid attention to very small changes. Sleep at night no longer restored strength the way it used to. Mornings felt heavier to wake into. Heating took longer but produced less effect. These things were not severe enough to be called a disaster, but they were enough for experienced people to begin adjusting. Adjustment here did not mean grand actions. It could be moving sleeping places closer to the hearth, changing the timing of lighting the fire, reducing daytime activity to conserve energy, or making early, difficult decisions about rations. To modern people, such choices may sound extreme, but to medieval people, they were survival reflexes. They understood that every day of delay was a day the body grew weaker, and once the body was weak, every measure became too late. In that context, winter was not the only enemy. The true enemy was delay in awareness. When a family could no longer read the signals that life was sending, they began to lose their way inside their own home. And from that point on, each subsequent sign was no longer a warning, but a step from which there was no return. What followed did not happen in a single moment. It was a chain reaction, where every ignored sign opened the door to a greater danger. And once that chain began, winter no longer needed to grow colder. It had already won. Every medieval family that had endured many winters understood a terrifying truth. Once the first sign was ignored, the signs that followed would come faster, heavier, and without allowing correction. Winter did not kill with a single blow. It wore people down layer by layer, day by day, until there was nothing left to resist. The first escalation always began with the most familiar thing: fire. The fire still burned in the hearth, even more fiercely than before, yet the house no longer warmed as it had in past years. People sat closer to the fire, pulled their clothes tighter, but the cold did not leave. This was the moment that made experienced people begin to fear. Because when fire could no longer defeat the cold, the problem was not the amount of wood, but the very living structure of the house itself. Moisture had sunk deep in. Walls and floors no longer retained heat, but began to draw it from human bodies. Every log thrown into the hearth at this point was no longer a solution, but a sacrifice of resources, for a battle whose balance was already tilting. When fire began to lose, smoke immediately became the next enemy. It no longer escaped quickly through the roof. It lingered longer, heavier, sharper. The smell of smoke changed, no longer dry, but acrid and suffocating. Medieval people did not need to understand chemistry to know this was dangerous. They only needed to know that when smoke stayed too long, the air inside the house began to turn toxic. They kept the fire to fight the cold, yet that very fire made them weaken more quickly. This was winter's cruel paradox. The source of life and the threat existed side by side, and the line between them was so thin it could not be seen. The next escalation appeared at the table. Food was still cooked, still hot to the touch, yet the body was no longer warmed from the inside. Adults finished eating and still shivered. Children finished eating and were still exhausted. This was the sign that the meal had lost its most important function: producing heat. When rations lacked fat and energy, the body no longer had enough strength to resist prolonged cold. Medieval people could endure hunger in the short term, but what they feared most was eating without recovery. because that signaled that the body had begun to expend more than it could replace. Then came signs that were even more frightening, because they were silent. Children began to sleep unusually long. No crying, no demands, lying still for hours. Modern people might see that as a good thing, but for medieval families, that silence sent a chill down the spine. When the body is too exhausted to react, that is when it begins to let go. The elderly were the same. They complained less about the cold, moved less. Not because they were getting stronger, but because they no longer had enough energy to fully feel the cold. An even greater escalation came from a place few expected, the livestock pen. The animals clustered together, not eating even though fodder was still there. They trembled or stood completely motionless. Medieval people believed that animals sensed changes in the environment earlier than humans. When livestock began to surrender to winter, that was the final warning. Because if creatures accustomed to living outdoors could no longer endure it, then the humans inside that damp, cold house were only a step behind. The most frightening thing about this chain of escalation was that there was no single moment that truly looked like a disaster. There was no collapse, no great storm, no clear sign to cry out for help. There was only steady weakening, little by little. Each day that passed, the family was still alive, but living worse than the day before. And when they finally realized they no longer had the strength to repair the house, replace the thatch, adjust the fire, or change their habits, winter no longer needed to grow harsher. It had already finished its work. This chain of signs was not book knowledge. It was collective memory, passed down through stories of loss. The families who survived did not do so because they were stronger, but because they stopped in time to read the signals that life was sending in silence. If you have followed this far, try asking yourself this. In our modern world, are there winter signs being ignored simply because they are too small, too familiar, too quiet? If you have thoughts of your own, share them in the comments. Sometimes a perspective spoken at the right moment can help someone else recognize what they are unknowingly overlooking. The most painful turning point of the story did not lie in the cold nor in hunger. It lay in a mental moment that many medieval families never recognized until it was too late. The moment when they believed everything was still under control, while in reality, their system of survival had already begun to collapse from the inside. The twist lies here. Most families did not die on the coldest night. They died afterward, after winter had already defeated them mentally. When people stopped reacting to warning signs, that was not calmness, but depletion. When someone no longer complained about the cold, no longer worried, no longer adjusted the fire or the rations, that was the moment they no longer had enough energy to save themselves. Medieval people understood this in a deeply instinctive way. They did not call it depression or exhaustion, but they recognized something terrifying. When a family stopped repairing its house, winter had already entered inside. When floor straw was no longer replaced, when drafts were no longer sealed, when people accepted sleeping in colder places instead of trying to move. That was the moment the battle was decided, regardless of whether the snow outside melted or not. The response to this truth is deeply uncomfortable, because it shows that survival is not only a material issue, but also a matter of awareness. The families who survived were not the ones with the most firewood or the best food. They were the ones who recognized early that Normal was no longer normal. They changed before change became mandatory, sometimes only a week earlier, sometimes only a few days earlier. But that short span of time created the boundary between life and death. Medieval winter did not need to become more brutal to kill people. It only needed humans to be exhausted long enough to stop reacting. At that point, the cold, hunger, and dampness simply finished the remaining work. And the most thought-provoking thing is that this process unfolded in silence. No one recognized the moment they crossed the point of no return. The twist of this story is not meant to spread fear, but to remind us of a universal truth. When people stop listening to the small signals of weakening, disaster does not need to be loud to happen. It only needs time. When looking back at medieval winters, what confuses modern people is not the cold itself, but the way people lived alongside it. They had no technology, no forecasts, no support systems, but they possessed something we are gradually losing: the ability to listen to very small signals before everything collapses. For them, survival was not about defeating winter, but about not letting themselves slip past the point of no return. Medieval winter teaches a quiet but profound lesson. People do not fall because of a single great catastrophe. They fall because of many small changes that are dismissed as not serious yet. A night's sleep that no longer restores strength, a meal that no longer warms the body, a house that no longer responds to fire as it once did. When those things appear together, winter is no longer outside. It has entered the rhythm of daily life itself. Perhaps the most thought-provoking thing of all is the very simple aspiration of medieval families. They did not dream of wealth nor of power. They only hoped to have enough strength to repair the house one more time, enough clarity to light the hearth one more morning, enough energy to carry the entire family through another cold night. That aspiration may sound small, but it was precisely what kept people standing through the most brutal winters in history. When reflecting on the present, we can ask ourselves, in this world of comfort, are we ignoring our own warning signs? Not signs of the weather, but signs of exhaustion, imbalance, of everything still looking fine, while cracks have already begun to form inside. History does not repeat itself exactly, but the way humans ignore warnings remains frighteningly the same. The story of medieval families is not meant to make us fear the past. It reminds us to value the ability to recognize, adjust, and act early. Because sometimes the difference between making it through and collapsing does not lie in strength, but in whether you stop early enough to listen. If this story has made you reflect on your own winters, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else notice what they are unknowingly overlooking. And if you want to continue exploring authentic stories of survival from the past, where people learned how to stand firm under the harshest conditions, subscribe to the channel and join us on the journeys ahead.